It now seems clear to me that we are facing a siege on both the social and religious front. The so-called emergency pandemic has been utilized as a false pretext to impose the vaccination and the Green Pass in many nations of the world in a simultaneous and coordinated way. At the same time, on the other front, not only do the ecclesiastical authorities not condemn in the least the abuse of power by those who govern public affairs, but they support them in this wicked plan and go so far as to condemn those who do not accept being subjected to inoculation with an experimental gene serum with unknown side effects that does not impart any immunity from the virus, to say nothing of the moral implications related to the presence of genetic material derived from aborted fetuses, which for a Catholic is itself a more than sufficient reason to refuse the vaccine. We are at war, a war that is not openly declared, that is not fought with conventional weapons, but a war all the same, in which there are aggressors and aggressees, executioners and victims, kangaroo courts and prisoners. A war in which violence is used in ostensibly legal forms in order to violate the rights of citizens as well as believers. It is an epochal war that is a prelude to the end times and the great apostasy spoken of in sacred scripture.
Next year, vaccine policy is economic policy. It is even a higher priority than the traditional tools of fiscal and monetary policy. Why? Because without it, we cannot turn the fate of the world economy around. And it is, as Chair Powell said, smart policy. We calculated at the fund that between now and 2025, we will add $9 trillion to global output if everybody is vaccinated faster. And the other interesting piece of this is 60% will go to the developing and emerging market economies. 40% of the benefit would go to advanced economies, and that would translate into $1 trillion additional tax revenues in advanced economies. I cannot think of a better value for money this and next year than investing in accelerated vaccination.
We currently have somewhere north of 9.5 billion people on the planet. Very sound predictions hold that there will be over 9.7 billion people on the planet by 2050. Our resources that support our already large population will be vastly insufficient to meet the needs of our growing population. So, you know, sounds awful, but the human race has faced this dilemma before. One of my favorite examples is Thomas Malthus, who wrote a treatise about this, and he made the astute observation that the rate of growth of the production of food was outpaced by the rate of growth of population.
Darwin said this again and again, and everyone knows it, that Malthus served as his chief inspiration. And what did Darwin's hero, the oh-so-Reverend Thomas Malthus, propose to do about overpopulation among human beings?
All children who are born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavouring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction, which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools, and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders.
The British oligarchy had made Malthus a great hero already by the middle of the 19th century, so Darwin knew precisely what Malthus had argued. But to situate the importance of this Malthus-Darwin duo, let's listen to what H.G. Wells, from 1866 to 1946, that was when he lived, had to say in his 1903 book, Anticipations, upon which he said the entire rest of his life's work was based. And Wells, at the very centre of the British imperial priesthood, he was a co-founder with Bertrand Russell of the Fabian Society, a fierce advocate of eugenics, like Russell and the rest of the Fabians, and a co-inventor with Julian Huxley and a couple of others of the modern cult of environmentalism. In the first chapter of Wells's book, entitled Locomotion, he lamented about the American Revolution, that the American Revolution had unleashed, in particular, how railroads, quote, had changed the intellectual life of the world. As you will hear in more depth from Gabby tomorrow, Lincoln's victory over the British in the US Civil War of 1861 to 65 had unleashed an astonishing growth of nation-states around the world, who copied the American system methods of public credit, intercontinental railroads, the advocacy of science and technology, and the creation of a literate citizenry. Along with the rapidly growing United States, these developments gave rise to powerful new nation-states in Germany, Russia, Japan, and elsewhere, and a surging growth in world population. All of this was a strategic threat to the British maritime world empire, and the British responded by unleashing World War I and proposing to mass murder entire sections of the world's population in the new doctrine of eugenics. In his book, Wells exulted that the influence of Malthus and Darwin by the end of the 19th century had virtually destroyed Christianity. The ideas of this duo, said Wells, will form the basis for the ethical reconstruction of mankind, and they had become pervasive enough even then to usher in what Wells called, quote, the New Republic, as the foundation for the coming world state, i.e., the total triumph of the British Empire worldwide through globalisation and the global governance of green fascism. So how in the world could anyone argue that it is unclear whether Darwin really intended eugenics? He was blatant, as was his bulldog Thomas Huxley, as was Darwin's entire family. Bulldog Huxley continually wailed that overpopulation was destined to be the world's gravest problem. As for Darwin's own family, his eldest son, Major Leonard Darwin, was president of the British Eugenics Education Society from its founding in 1911 until 1928, and its honorary president until his death in 1943. Leonard also chaired the first International Eugenics Congress in 1912, while Darwin's two other sons, George Howard and Horace, were both members of the Cambridge Eugenics Society, and Howard's son, Charles Galton Darwin, was Life Fellow of the Eugenics Society and its Vice President in 1939, and president from 1953 to 59. So this so-called debate over whether Darwin intended to push eugenics is as much a fraud as Darwin himself, because Darwin, a neurotic hypochondriac who rarely left his house, was not a man but a project, a witting project, a figurehead for the cultural warfare run top-down by the Privy Council of the British Crown, one of whose members was Darwin's bulldog, Huxley. The British East India Company was also part of this, and its network of salons and front groups, and the elite men's clubs of London, including the X-Club of so-called scientists, which Huxley founded to ram through Darwinism. That's who created Darwinism. Darwin himself discovered nothing and took all the key axioms of his so-called theory of evolution from others. Huxley called a meeting of 7 of his best mates and co-thinkers on November 3rd, 1864 at the St George Hotel in London. Joined by a 9th one the following month, they called themselves the X-Club and were carefully chosen so as to represent all fields of science. With the backing of all the elite clubs, many of which were dominated by the apostles, over the next 3 decades, the X-Club pro-feudal maniacs took over most of the top positions in British science and reshaped the ruling culture of Britain itself. They dominated the Royal Society, as well as most of the top institutions running educational policy in Britain, including the numerous parliamentary committees whistled up to ram through reform. As just one example among dozens, Huxley himself chaired the London School Board, which set elementary educational policy for the rest of the country and which the London Times declared to be the most powerful body outside of Parliament.